Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I'd like to touch on a topic that we've discussed before, but I think it's important that we go into a little more detail, and that's about God's will. As we're going through this pandemic and continued lockdowns and frustration growing across the country about whether or not the disease is going to finally go away and what's going to happen to our economy, we're hearing talk about, where's God in all this and what's His will? Is this God's will that we suffer like this? Well, let me just start off by saying this. Oftentimes when there are personal tragedies, others will come to the person suffering and trying to comfort them. They have all good intentions and they'll say, well, it was God's will. Like if somebody dies suddenly or, God forbid, whether it's a child or anyone, sometimes you'll hear someone come and say, it was God's will. I don't think so. I really don't think so. God doesn't want bad things to happen to us. He wants only good things to happen to us. If God wanted bad things to happen, if He wanted people to suffer through death and illness and injury, that's not the God that I think we want to be worshiping. No, God always wills for the good. But things happen in life that impact God's will. And we're going to talk about this. God's will is actually broken up into three parts. What God intends for us, the circumstances of the world, and how that impacts on what God is wanting for us, but ultimately how God brings good out of bad situations. One of the things we do as we train our deacons is to how to approach people in a pastoral way when they visit someone who has experienced some sort of tragedy or some sort of loss. The one thing we don't tell them to say is to try to comfort them by saying, this is God's will. We don't do that at all. Matter of fact, what we tell them to do is just be there, just to be present. Just their presence is a sign to the grieving person that the church is with them, that God is with them in this time. You don't have to say anything in those situations. Eventually they'll offer to pray, but initially the most important way to convey that God is in the midst of all this suffering is just the physical presence with this person, with the family, and to be there in a prayerful way, and then to offer their ministry to them. So let's look at God's will, the three parts of God's will. The first part is what we call God's intentional will, or His active will. And that is always for good. God always wants us to have good things. And He wants us to use those good things, not for selfish reasons, but to bring good into the world, to use the gifts and talents that He gives to us so that we can make the world a better place and we can build up His kingdom. But the circumstances of life, this imperfect world that has as part of it, through the sin of our first parents, sin and evil and sickness and death and destruction, that is all part of this imperfect world. They will sometimes create an impact on what God ultimately intentionally wants for us. But then we call that God's permissive will. But ultimately we see God's final will, or as I said, His ultimate will, that He will bring us to Himself. What we see is not all that we get. There is much more to come in eternity. A life of glory with the Lord. And ultimately, God is going to triumph over sin and death and evil, and He's going to bring us to Himself. An example where we see how things impact God's will might be in a situation where a parent looking at a newborn child has all kinds of dreams and hopes for that child. All kinds of professions that are good, that are service related, that are helping others, whether it's in business or the medical profession or legal profession or law enforcement or firefighting or whatever it may be, nurses, doctors, people who bring goods and services to others, farmers. I mean, the list is endless. So a parent has all these good thoughts and wishes and hopes for their child. That's their intentional will. But as the child grows, and now they're 18 and they originally planned to go off to college or trade school, they come to their parents and they tell them that there's this civil war going on in a third world country somewhere, and people are dying and children are starving and women are being assaulted. So they've joined Catholic Relief Services as a volunteer to go to this third world country for the next year or two in order to bring about some good, in order to help relieve the suffering of these poor people who are going through this tragedy. And your reaction initially is, no, that's not what I wanted for you. You're going to go to school. You're going to be this profession or that profession. I want you to be a person of integrity. I want you to be a person who's going to contribute to the world. But then you realize that what they're doing is good. It does have integrity. They are contributing to the world by going to this far-off place to volunteer their services, to maybe sacrifice their lives. That is actually what you wanted for them. You wanted them, the bottom line was to be a person of goodness, a person of integrity, a person who would give back to society to help make the world a better place. And that's what they're ultimately doing. So ultimately, your will for them to be a good person, to be a person of integrity, to offer service to others, has been fulfilled. So that's kind of how the circumstances of life, the circumstances of the world can impact on the intentional will, but ultimately the true will is realized. Another example of that is a story I read in a book by a priest by the name of Father Joseph Breighner. Father Joseph Breighner was a retreat director and author, and he also had a radio show in Baltimore, Maryland. He's a priest from the Archdiocese of Baltimore, and he goes around the country and giving retreats. I'm not sure if he still does that anymore. And he wrote a series of books about God's will and where is God when bad things happen. And he has a book, which I'm going to show you here. It's called When Life Doesn't Make Sense. When Life Doesn't Make Sense, Father Joseph Breighner. It's a great read. It's an easy read. You can get through it probably in a day. It's $12 on Amazon. It's still available. And he explains this three-part will of God. And there's a story in here which I think kind of sums up what we're talking about today. How we might have our own dreams and hopes and thoughts about what we would like the world to look like, what we would like our own lives to look like. But if we open our hearts, remain faithful, and always stay close to God and listen to what He wants us to do, ultimately we'll be serving a much higher purpose, and that's where we're going to try. That's where we're going to find true happiness. So I'll finish with this story from Father Breighner's book. He had a story about three trees. Now you have to have a little bit of an imagination here. Pretend that these three trees could actually talk. So these three small trees are in the forest, planted next to each other, and they're growing up. They're becoming very tall and strong. And as they're maturing, the one tree says, when I'm fully matured, I hope that my lumber is used to make a magnificent house where people from all over the world will come and be entertained and enjoy themselves, and they'll marvel at the beauty of the wood that created this house that came from me. The second tree says, well, when I'm fully matured, I would love for my labor to be used to make a magnificent ship with a tall mast that will sail the seven seas and take people to very exotic places, and they can enjoy the wonders of the world by traveling in a ship made from the wood of my tree. And the third tree says, well, when I'm fully matured, I want my lumber to be used to make a magnificent tall tower that people will come from all over, and they'll climb this tower to the top, and they can see the entire world from the top of this tower made from the lumber of my tree. Well, ultimately, the three trees did fully mature, and they were cut down to be used for different things. But it wasn't what they had hoped. It wasn't what they had willed. The first tree was used to make a feeding trough for a stable, and that feeding trough eventually became a manger for a tiny little baby. The second tree was not made to be a magnificent ship, but rather a small rowboat that found work in the Sea of Galilee, and it held a great teacher who preached to the people hungry for hope that were standing on the shore listening to him. The third tree perhaps had the greatest outcome, but it was nothing at all what he had hoped. The third tree was cut into two separate pieces, and the two pieces were hooked, fastened across from each other, and then stuck into the ground. And on that tree, they nailed the Savior of the world, the cross. Those trees did not grow up to be what they had hoped to be, but they grew up to be something much greater because it was God's will. My friends, as we continue in this lockdown, in this pandemic, and our economy slowly trying to come back, remember that God didn't will all of this suffering. He willed for good. He willed for us to be good, and He's going to bring good out of it. And we can already see signs of that in family life, in prayer life. And we will all be together again one day, worshiping in a church with one another. But in the meantime, just stay faithful. Keep your eye on the Lord. Keep your ears and your heart open to His word. Remain faithful. And ultimately, everything will be okay. This is not going to end bad. This will end good, because God always brings good out of it. He brought His Son into the world not to die, but to spread the good news. But He knew that the circumstances of the world, that when people heard His message, they would kill Him because they didn't like what He had to say. But ultimately, we know on Easter Sunday, Jesus rose from the dead, and God's will, His ultimate will, was to triumph over sin and death and to give us life. And that's exactly what happened. And we have that in the real example of Jesus Christ. Hopefully, this has been a little bit of a help to put this kind of in perspective for everyone. And I wish you all the best and continued good health and safety. And until next time, may God bless you.